The sun was just starting to set as she walked hand in hand with the two children, their laughter echoing through the quiet street. A simple moment. A black mother and her two white children should have been just that. But for the officers who pulled up with flashing lights and harsh commands, it was something else entirely. Without a second thought, they surrounded her, voices sharp, suspicion heavy in the air. She tried to explain, but they weren't listening. The children cried, confused and scared, reaching for the woman who had always been their protector. But the officers saw something different. Assumptions, stereotypes, and quick judgments turned an ordinary evening into something far more dangerous. What they didn't know, what they didn't even stop to ask, would change everything. And by the time they realized the truth, it was too late. Stay with us as we uncover what really happened that night. She stood frozen, heart pounding, as the officers closed in. The children clung to her, their small hands gripping her arms, their eyes wide with fear. She wanted to tell them it would be okay, but even she wasn't sure. Every time she tried to speak, an officer cut her off, demanding answers she wasn't given a chance to provide. People had started to gather, whispers spreading through the crowd. A few pulled out their phones, recording the scene unfolding before them. But no one stepped forward. No one dared to challenge the officers who had already decided she was a threat. The woman glanced at the children, her mind racing. She had cared for them, loved them like her own. But none of that mattered now. All they saw was a black woman with two white children, and in their eyes, something didn't add up. And then one of the officers reached for his radio. The officer's hand hovered over his radio, his eyes locked on the woman as if waiting for her to make the wrong move. She could feel the weight of their suspicion pressing down on her, the unspoken accusations thick in the air. The children were crying now, their voices trembling as they called out for her. But their words didn't seem to matter. The officers were too focused on their own assumptions to hear the truth. A woman in the crowd stepped forward hesitantly. "I think you should listen to her," she said, her voice careful, almost unsure. Another man muttered, "She's just walking with her kids." But the officers barely acknowledged them. To them, this wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a situation that needed control. The woman's mind raced. She thought about all the times she had been overlooked, questioned, doubted. But this was different. This time, the stakes were higher. One wrong move, one misunderstood action, and everything could spiral further out of control. Then one of the children did something unexpected. He broke free from her grasp and ran toward one of the officers, his small hands clutching at the man's uniform. "She's my mom," the boy sobbed. His words rang out in the tense silence, but the question remained, was anyone willing to believe him? The boy's voice cut through the chaos, raw with emotion. He clung to the officer's uniform, his small fingers gripping tightly, as if holding on could somehow fix everything. But the officer barely reacted. His eyes flickered with hesitation, but he didn't loosen his stance. The others didn't either. The woman took a slow breath, trying to steady herself. "Please," she said, her voice firm but calm. "Let me explain." But before she could get another word out, one of the officers stepped forward. "Ma'am, we need you to back away," he ordered, his hand drifting toward his belt. The crowd murmured louder now, their unease growing. More phones were recording, and someone was asking questions, demanding to know what was happening. The children were sobbing, their faces streaked with tears. And then, just as it seemed like things couldn't get worse, another patrol car pulled up. More officers stepped out. The tension in the air tightened like a rope pulled too tight. The woman knew she had little time. She had to make them listen before things spiraled even further. But how do you make people see the truth when they've already made up their minds? The woman's pulse pounded in her ears as the second patrol car came to a stop. More officers stepped out, scanning the scene with sharp, assessing eyes. The crowd had grown, their whispers turning into murmurs of concern, but no one dared to step between her and the officers. Then a voice cut through the tension. "Wait, I know her." A man pushed forward, his suit slightly wrinkled, as if he had just rushed from work. He looked from the officers to the woman, his expression shifting from confusion to urgency. "She's not a stranger," he said, his voice firm. "She's their legal guardian." For a moment, everything froze. The officers exchanged glances, their rigid postures faltering just slightly. The woman felt the tiniest flicker of hope, but it was short-lived. "Sir, step back," one officer warned. "We need to confirm that." The man's jaw tightened. "Call it in," he shot back. "You're making a mistake." But the officer's hand was still near his belt, his stance still tense. The woman exhaled shakily. Even with the truth coming to light, she could see it, the hesitation, the doubt. And she knew, in that moment, that words alone might not be enough to stop what was coming next. One of the officers finally reached for his radio, speaking in a low, controlled voice. The woman held her breath, gripping the children's hands tightly as they clung to her. The man who had stepped forward, her lawyer, the one person who knew the truth, stood his ground, his eyes locked on the officers, daring them to make another mistake. Seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The radio crackled, a response coming through. The lead officer's expression shifted, his posture stiffening. He glanced back at the woman, then at the children, then at his fellow officers. Something had changed. Then just like that, the tension broke. The officer took a step back. "We've confirmed her identity," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "She's their guardian." The woman let out a shaky breath, but before she could speak, the final twist hit. A woman from the crowd, who had been silently watching, suddenly stepped forward. "You see her now," she said, voice steady but laced with something sharp. But what if no one had spoken up? What if the cameras weren't here? The officers had no response. The crowd murmured in agreement. The truth had come out, but the damage had already been done. The woman stood there for a moment, her grip still firm around the children's hands. The officers, now silent, avoided her gaze as if unsure how to undo what had just happened. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but the weight of what had unfolded remained heavy in the air. The man who had spoken up turned to her. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. She nodded, but the truth was, she wasn't sure. The children clung to her, their little faces still streaked with tears. They didn't fully understand what had happened, but they had felt it. The fear, the doubt, the unfairness of it all. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her heart heavy, but her head high. This time, the officers let her go. But as she disappeared down the street, one thing was clear. The real issue wasn't just this moment. It was much bigger than that.